Hey guys, Mike from the Rewatch Project here. Just wanted to put a little bit of extra content up on our YouTube channel. This is some stuff that I recorded a little while ago for some other platforms that I work for, namely Chinstroker vs. Punter and Podsyndicate, but they're just kind of sitting around on those podcast feeds, which in the case of Podsyndicate, doesn't get updated quite as often as it used to. So I thought that I would just repurpose that and put that up here, where it seems a little bit more relevant, particularly as it's film, television, pop culture based. This is a conversation that I had not too long ago with producer, writer, director, jack of all trades, Donald Bellisario, probably most well known for TV shows, for creating and writing and producing and directing shows like Magnum PI, Quantum Leap, Airwolf, Tales from the Gold Monkey, NCIS. He's just one of the mainstays of 80s television, along with people like Aaron Spelling and Glenn Larson and Stephen J. Cannell. So this was a very interesting conversation. Great guy, great life. So I'm going to put that up here and enjoy, and we will be back with some regular Rewatch Projects with Hannah and Mike content soon. And I'll be putting up some new music stuff on the front row, and also hopefully some interviews and other bits of video content along with the regular podcast too. So enjoy. Now, long-time listeners will know that we have had the privilege to be joined by creatives from many of our favourite entertainment franchises on the show, but few have cast more of a shadow over our formative entertainment years than this producer, screenwriter, showrunner, and I think it's fair to say ubiquitous figure in television for over 40 years, with a body of work that includes Kojak, Battlestar Galactica, Quincy ME, and creating iconic franchises, including Magnum PI, Tales of the Gold Monkey, Airwolf, Quantum Leap, JAG and NCIS, amongst many others. It is an honour to welcome Mr. Donald P Bellisario. Thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Well, nice to be here.
And I thought it would just be a good sort of jumping off point for listeners who certainly know your work, but maybe don't know that much about your career. That early in your television career, after your time in the Marine Corps and transitional work in the world of advertising, you worked with two other gentlemen that you would go on to join as being, I think it's fair to say, defining names in this era and beyond, namely Stephen J. Cannell and Glenn Larson. And I thought it might be a great entry point if you could just tell us a little bit about your work and experiences with these gentlemen and where you were in your career at the time.
I was just getting into television at the time. I had been in advertising for my career. I graduated with a degree in advertising, and so that's what I followed, but I really wanted to do a longer form. So I wanted to do an hour television or half hour, whatever I could get into. And I approached Steve Cannell, and Steve was a great help. Steve was he was a wonderful mentor to whoever worked with him. He just showed you the ropes from the very beginning, and I admired him and wish I could be like him.
And of course, Steve Cannell is very well known to audiences from the image of him pulling the paper from the typewriter at the end of all of his shows. Yeah. And you yourself had a very iconic logo as well. I always remember the Bellisaurus image was one that's very ingrained in the subconscious of viewers of a certain age. And so those early experiences with Cannell, I mean, am I correct in thinking that you started off, was it as a story editor for him?
I started with him writing for Baba Black Sheep. And since I had been a Marine and an aviator, that was a show right up my alley. I was able to write it without any difficulty. And that Steve loved that. So it was in my wheelhouse.
And then you'd go on to work with Larson. I think initially on Battlestar, I believe you did some scripts there.
I did one episode. I did one episode, a 2-hour episode of Battlestar Galactica, and Glenn wanted me to do more, but I went on to do other things, including working for Steve. I worked for Glenn first, then Steve.
And I mean, I'd imagine as well. I'm just curious as to the transition from advertising as well. In the advertising world, were you directing? Were you filmmaking in that area?
I did everything. I directed my commercials. I wrote them. I did everything but act in them. I couldn't bring myself to act in them.
And do you think that that had an effect on your ethic, your work ethic, when you would become a producer? Because I understand you were very hands-on throughout your entire career as a producer.
Absolutely.
What does a producer do, or what does Donald Bellisario do on a show on a day-to-day basis?
Everything. Be honest with you, do everything. Write the shows, direct them, produce them, uh, just about everything.
And is that normal? Is that just you?
That's not normal. Usually somebody works in one area only. I just jumped into everything from the beginning. I liked making film. So let's put it that way. That's really what it is. It's making film.
And why television? I mean, was that just circumstance, as opposed to film, of course? Was that just circumstance, or was there something about the form, or was it financial necessity? What was it specifically about the episodic world?
Well, there was a financial end to it at the very beginning. I remember that I was interviewing for a job, and I can't remember now who it was with, but he said to me, you'll be able to, I said, how long will it take before I get a script on air? He says, oh, you'll have a script. It was Steve Cannell, come to think of it. It was Steve. He says, you'll have a script within a year. And I said, I got enough money to last me 6 weeks. So, I got to have something on the air in 6 weeks, which I did.
Wow, there's a story I've heard you tell before that I've actually used in my own life that I'd be really interesting to hear you relay for our listeners, assuming, of course, you feel comfortable doing that, where it sounds to me, Don, knowing a little bit about your career, that you're a great example of, I suppose, what people might call self-actualization, this idea of making things happen. And one story I've heard, I was just wondering if you could tell our listeners about, did you once buy a house in order to motivate yourself to get work? Is that a true story? Could you just tell us a little bit about the mindset of that?
That's a true story. I bought a house, and I said, well, now I've got to get a job, got to get a gig, because I'm not going to give up and lose a house. I've never done anything like that in my life. I'm not going to start now. So I had to get money within 6 weeks. And I just wrote until I got something.
Well, I mean, and that clearly worked. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
I think also one of the yeah. Well, I mean, and that's the thing. Like I say, that's a very, and it's also a motivating story to hear as well. I mean, I think another thing as well is when you made a point of your career, a sort of a juncture in your career that I find really interesting, is when you made the transition to creating your own shows. Now, my understanding is that came out of an experience that you had on Quincy, on the Jack Klugman show, where you were struggling to work within the confines of the show, and out of that, I suppose, came Magnum PI. And I understand Glenn Larson was involved in a very broad sense at the initial point, but then you took on the show. Could you just explain a little bit how that happened, how it went from being a Glenn Larson pitch to being your show?
Well, Glenn had a deal with Universal to put Tom Selleck in an hour episode of something. And that was Glenn's contribution to it. He had Selleck. And Selleck had, to be honest with you, Selleck said he'd pound roofing nails before he'd do a Glenn Larson show. So they said, well, what would you do? And he said, well, there's this guy that you have in the studio named Bellisario, and he's doing some pretty good stuff. I'd work with him. So that's how it came about. And actually, Tom approached me to work with him. And we had lunch together, and I said, Tom, what would you like to do? And he says, I don't want to play myself. I said, that's good. I can do that. So I went and wrote Magnum.
And was that was Magnum a sort of a bespoke project that you wrote for Selleck specifically, or was it were you adapting another idea that you had, or was it already formed? Where did it come from conceptually?
It was an idea that I had, but I adapted it for Selleck and wrote it for him specifically.
Yeah, and I can see as well. I mean, why you know. I mean, I know that Selleck did do a couple of unsold pilots before that. He'd done Rockford, obviously, I think a couple of times before that. And I mean, obviously you had the Central as well as to Selleck's charisma on that show were the support characters as well, like Rick and TC and those guys and that team. Where did those characters come from?
Oh, they just came out of my head, out of my life, out of being in the Marine Corps. I can't say where characters come from. I sit down and I write. I don't do a story. I'm very unusual in that way. I don't do a story. I sit down and I write fade in and I start writing. And as I write, the story develops. And so it entertains me the same way it entertains an audience because I don't know it in advance.
Wow, so you're kind of throwing the track down in front of the train, so to speak, when you're that's very consistent with the mentality of somebody who would buy a house to motivate their own career success. So you're a very psychologically a very consistent person there, Don. I suppose also key to Magnum PI was the setting of Hawaii, and I think that an entire generation have based their view of what Hawaii is like on Magnum PI. But am I correct in understanding that you tried to de-emphasize the sort of the urbanization of Hawaii in the way that you presented it on the show?
Well, I had never been to Hawaii when I wrote that.
Oh, okay.
I'd never been to Hawaii. So the Hawaii I wrote was the one that was in my head, that I imagined Hawaii to be. And then once I wrote it, I went to Hawaii and saw that it was a little different from what I had in my head, but it didn't make any difference. I kept the show the way I had written it, and it made it a different show for Hawaii. I think it made it a better show that way. So it was fun to work on, and it was a challenge always.
And it was also fairly immediate success for you as well. I'm just wondering, on a personal level, what that was like. I mean, obviously, I'm sure financially it was very, very rewarding and very creatively validating as well. But how did your life change with Magnum?
Well, when you say financially, the second year of Magnum, I made more money than I had collectively my entire life up until I did Magnum. So
Wow.
that was a big financial windfall for me. And I went on from there.
And one of the things as well, I just wanted to mention before moving on, is vehicles, cars, planes, helicopters. I know that many of these are interests of yours, but it seems to me like shows of this era really did fetishize the cars, the vehicles. What do you think it was about that era? I mean, I know that still exists, obviously, but there's something very specific about that late 70s through to the mid to late 80s where there seems to be this huge cultural fascination with the vehicles and the cars that these characters have. Have you got any thoughts on that? Because you were very central to that, I think, in many ways.
I really don't. I had a love for cars, helicopters, planes, anything that moved and flew. I loved, and I would put them in my shows, and I knew them because I was a pilot, and so I knew the ins and outs of it.
The next show that you go on to, to create Tales of the Gold Monkey. Now, I'm sure you're aware of this, but this show was huge in England, where I grew up. This was a very popular show. I remember I'd probably been about 11 or 12 years old when Tales of the Gold Monkey came out. And I remember it was the show, for a good year or so, it was the show that we all played on the playground at school. And then this was before the internet. This was before we had entertainment news. The show just vanished. It just disappeared. And I remember very clearly me and all of my friends being, where is our beloved Tales of the Gold Monkey go? So, I mean, what was it a production cost thing because it was a period drama?
Cost thing. It was a matter of poor judgment by the network. That show would have run for 5 years without any trouble at all. And the network didn't see it at that time. They just didn't see it. And they only let it run a year and they canceled it, which was a disappointment to me and a surprise, honestly, because I thought the show was, as I say, I thought the show was going for 5 years at minimum.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting one, and on our show, on our podcast, we've covered a lot of your work, and Tales of the Gold Monkey was the one that we got the most response from it, and it did surprise me that show, to this day, is very beloved by a lot of people. And I've got one question for you, Don, that I've been wanting to ask you probably since about 1982. But did you ever get to fly Cutter's Goose?
Did I ever get to fly Cutter's Goose?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure I did. Of course I did.
Oh, my goodness. I don't think I've ever been quite as envious as anybody in the world as I am of you right now that you got to fly Cutter's Goose. Where did Gold Monkey come from in your mind? Was it your love of those 30s action movies, or where did Gold Monkey come from?
Well, my love of flying was really behind all that. What more fun can you have than to create a show where you put in some airplanes or some helicopters and you get to fly? And that's what I wanted to do. And that's why I created those shows.
And also, I mean, I see a lot of, I suppose, your stock of actors again as well. Like we see people like Jeff McKay, John Colvin. I think you used Lance Legault a fair bit. Why is that? Is that just the practicalities of television that's the pull, or are you somebody who enjoys working with particular people?
They were people I enjoyed working with, and they were like my acting crew that I would put together and use over and over. I try to work them into each episode, or each show rather, not episode, but each show as a character, and it worked for them, it worked for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jeff McKay got to come back from the dead in Magnum, so I mean, that's living proof.
He's since passed on, which is a shame. But I loved working with Jeff.
Yeah, he's got a great presence. He's got one of the all-time great faces as well on television. There's something great about that guy's face. I mean, obviously, your interest in aviation and all of those things would come, I suppose, to a head with Airwolf. I mean, you were, another bow in your run of television shows, and it's interesting. And this is something that I don't think I've ever seen you talk about, but I'm curious to know. I've always felt that the pilot episode of Airwolf is a great film. I think it works very well as a movie from the production. But I also know that there was a movie cut of the pilot of Airwolf that was released internationally with some, stronger language and a little bit more violence, so it could play to an older audience at the cinemas. How did that come about? Was that just part of a contract for an overseas deal? And I've always wondered where that came from.
It was a way to take the 2 hours that was used to create the pilot and just turn it into a movie. In fact, what I tried to do was make movies. I didn't try to make pilots per se. I'd make a movie and work it from there. And that one was well liked by everybody. And the idea was, let's take it out and see if we can release it as a movie. And we did.
And it's interesting how if you go back and if you can, I think Airwolf sometimes unfairly gets bundled in with the super vehicle shows, the Knight Riders and the Blue Thunders. But I think it's fair to say that there was a quality to Airwolf, to the production quality of it, that really sets it apart from those. I mean, the pilot looked like it was a huge production. Is that fair to say?
It was a large production. The pilot of it did a lot of flying in that. I personally got to do a lot of flying, which
Oh wow,
kept me quite happy making the pilot. I don't know that the studio liked it that much, but I sure had fun. You know, the key is having fun when you make these things. If you're not having fun making them, they're not going to work. So I just make something that'll please me, and I'm fortunate in that what pleases me seems to please the public.
and I'm also interested to know that with Airwolf, for example, just let's use Airwolf as an example. You maintain your involvement in the show throughout its run, or do you? I mean, I know it's very common practice now for TV producers to create a show and then take a step back. Do you maintain that day to day on the show as it continues on to its second and third season, for example?
I try to maintain at least 2 to 3 seasons with a show to where I was involved in every script. And by that time, I had imprinted the show that I wanted into the episodes, and people could pick it up and make it from there. So once I got 2 to 3 seasons in, I could step off and do something else.
Another thing, actually, I've been always very curious to ask you about that pilot episode of Airwolf is you are mentioned in that episode. There's a moment where Jan Michael Vincent's character says that he's going out to do a reconnaissance fly for a Bellisario movie. I'm just curious, did you write that in? Did you write that line in? Can you remember, or was that something that was improvised?
You know, I really don't remember.
It's an early postmodern meta moment in in television.
I probably wrote it. It wouldn't have slipped in if I didn't write it.
Oh, really? So if people improvised on the set, would you ever include what they did, or were you quite sort of it's on the page? What was your sort of feeling around that type of collaboration?
It was basically on the page, although I would give some latitude to the actors when they wanted to take it out in a different direction or try something new. I'd go along with that. But basically, what I wrote is what you saw.
And then, of course, Airwolf would then be sold on to, I think, another network where it was produced with a different cast in Canada. I'm just curious, how did that deal come around? Was that to ensure syndication, or that odd final season of Airwolf? Where did that come about from?
That was the studio took it and went to Canada to make it cheaper, and I didn't want to make it as cheap as they wanted to make it. I didn't see that you could maintain the quality of the show at the money they would go for. So I withdrew from the project, and they took it to Canada and did it.
And of course, you were in the midst of an incredible run of success at this point. And I'm just wondering whether there was ever any competition, friendly or otherwise, between yourself and Larson and Bochco and Canal, or what was your relationship during those heady times?
No, I don't think there was any competition. We just all tried to make the best shows we could make. Like I say, I made shows to please me, and if they pleased the public, I was happy. It worked.
And then of course, I suppose the next big success that you had after that was Quantum Leap, which in many ways I've always referred to Quantum Leap as a stealth anthology show, in the sense that you got to have these movies each week. A couple of things about Quantum Leap I've often wondered is, first of all, do you consider it to be a science fiction show? I mean, obviously it's got science fiction elements, or was that science fiction element just a mechanism for you to tell these types of stories?
It was just a mechanism. I didn't consider it a science fiction show, although it has science fiction elements to it. Uh, it was a show that enabled me to do many different things. Each episode was a unique story in itself, which is difficult to do in television and have it work.
And I suppose one of the very clever conceits of Quantum Leap was the ending of each episode obviously would be a prologue to the next week's episode, so there was always this almost cliffhanger element. I'm just curious as to what you think about the shifts in television away from episodic television into longer form story arc type storytelling. Do you feel that's a positive thing, or do you prefer the 5-act structure of the standalone episode? How do you feel about where television is now?
I prefer the structure that's in the television that I used to do. I'm not involved in any of the television today, so I don't know what's going on actually.
Yeah,
I mean, past, but I can't talk about the present.
So, I mean, also with Quantum Leap, one of the things that really jumps out is the morality of the show and the heart of the show as well. Was Quantum Leap quite a personal project? I get the sense that it was a more personal project than many of the others.
That's a fair comment. I think it was. It was because it was a show that each episode was so totally different from the one that preceded it that I got a lot of creative juice out of it. So it was fun to make every week.
I was also wondering what the secret to your longevity is, because a lot of these shows that I've been covering are during that classic run, but of course subsequent to these you've had huge success with shows like JAG and NCIS, and your success continued on into the 21st century. What, if anything, is the secret of that longevity?
Characters. The characters in the shows. That's the secret to it. It's not the format of the show. It's the characters that are created and developed for the episodes. You get in love with those characters. They take you to places that you wouldn't go normally. You wouldn't even think about until you start writing for the characters.
And what do you feel is your best or favorite writing? Do you have an hour that you are particularly fond of, or that you reflect on still?
You mean an episode that I've done?
Yeah.
Like?
Yeah, sure.
No, there's a lot of them that I like. I like them all when I write them. You fall in love with your own words. But there's not any particular episode that stands out in my mind. Quantum Leap was a show on a whole that I liked best because I got to do a different show each week. So Quantum Leap was my favorite television series. No doubt about that.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, well, what a wonderful blank canvas of a show Quantum Leap must have been. I mean, the variety of tone that you got to do, and the issues of everything from race to sexual assault to, of course, probably most famously, the JFK assassination.
That's the only episode I ever did that had to do with something that really occurred in real life.
Because there was a conscious decision not to do that with Quantum Leap before, wasn't there?
Another episode that you'll find that is based on a real occurrence or a real event, but that one was.
Because my understanding is that when you had your personal encounter with Lee Harvey Oswald, obviously you put two and two together after the assassination. That, hey, that's the guy. That's somebody I know.
Lee Harvey Oswald and I had an interesting encounter when I was in the Marine Corps and he was in the Marine Corps. I came into I went to get some equipment from another base opposite of where I was stationed. And I went over to get some equipment that we didn't have. And I walked into this Quonset hut, and sitting on the floor, cross-legged, was Pravda open. Reading Pravda was Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, you didn't read Pravda at this particular time.
No, no.
And I said, what are you reading that for? You know, and he started giving me a line of bullshit. And I got upset, and I was getting really upset with him. And one of the other fellows there from that outfit said to me, let him go, he's harmless. I'll never forget that. Let him go, he's harmless.
Wow. And of course, the story that you told on Quantum Leap was very much going against the then current, very fashionable narrative that was conspiracy based. But you went the other way. You right. Went that, hey, no, this is, and I assume that's your personal feelings, that's your personal conviction.
It is. It is. It was an individual that did it, and there was no conspiracy involved in the killing.
Yeah, and I remember that seemed shocking at the time, but now, yeah, I mean, time has been very kind to that episode and that thought. Well, I'm very mindful of your time, Don, so I don't want to keep you any further. But before we go, I was just wondering if you've got any advice to any writers. I was just wondering if there's anything that you now know that you wish you'd known then.
That's an interesting question. Anything I know now that I wish I knew then? Probably that I did a little more discipline to what I was doing than I really did. I was pretty freewheeling in everything. And I think the shows could have been improved by having a little more discipline to them. But other than that, I loved making the shows. I still like them today. I'll see one, and it gives you a good feeling to see a show that you made 40 years ago and go, well, there's been changes in the production values of shows, but the basic show, the story, is still there and still good.
No, absolutely, and I think that your shows do transcend that time. I think that's why everybody's in such a hurry, unfortunately, to reboot them. But again, I'd just like to say thank you so much, not only for your time, but also for all of the years of entertainment, of such variety that you've provided to us. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, Don.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, everything you've said.
Thank you so much for your time. You have a great day. Stay safe.
You too.
All the best.